So while he was an undergraduate in physics, David had a student job with Professor Bill Bloom, who fostered his interest in biophysics and in the machinery of cells. He entered graduate school in biophysics here, did his thesis work in my lab, and worked on large biological structures, viruses and ribosomes. He became a postdoc at Cambridge with Sir Aaron Klug and developed a technique for reconstructing three-dimensional images from electron micrographs and used the technique to see the arrangement of protein molecules in viruses. This is the work actually that got Nobel Prize for Aaron Klug. The technique is the molecular-sized analog of a CAT scan. In 1969, he joined the faculty in chemistry at the University of Texas. He used the method of 3D reconstruction to study a fascinating enzyme complex which shuttles its substrates from one reactive site to the next using a swinging arm. And then in 1973, he was recruited to the physics department and later the biology department at Brandeis, where he used 3D reconstruction to determine the structures of various nanomachines found within cells. One of these machines, the bacterial flagellum, is the propulsion system for many species of bacteria and works like the outboard motor in a boat, each flagellum consisting of a rotary motor, a bushing, a drive shaft, a universal joint, and a propeller, all made from proteins. This work brought his name to the attention of the proponents of intelligent design, who used the flagellum as an example of a structure they argue could not have evolved. It was they who quoted him during the Dover, Pennsylvania trial, and it is that trial that will be the subject of his talk. I should mention that David retired 4 years ago. This is off-putting because he's my student. Okay. He retired 4 years ago to become a superannuated postdoctoral fellow in the laboratory of Gina Turrigiano at Brandeis, who studies neurons in the brain. And right now, he uses light microscopy instead of electron microscopy to determine the organization of proteins in the synapses that transmit information between neurons. But this talk is going to be about the bacterial flagellum. David DeRosier.
Well, thank you. I want you to know I got started right about back there, taking inorganic chemistry in this very lecture hall in 1957. Anyway, that's not what I'm going to talk about. So, intelligent design. There was a federal trial several years ago on intelligent design. And I was sort of indirectly involved because of a remark I made, I actually wrote down in a review that I wrote. And what I want to do is to tell you about my involvement and to tell you how I got interviewed by NOVA. NOVA made a two-hour program on the trial, and they came and interviewed me. So I want to tell you what happened and what I said and how I got involved. Well, it all began in 2004. The Dover area school district decided that they would have the following statement read to all ninth grade biology classes. And this is what they said: the Pennsylvania academic standards require students to learn about Darwin's theory of evolution and eventually to take a standardized test of which evolution is a part. Because Darwin's theory is a theory, it is still being tested as new evidence is discovered. The theory is not a fact. Gaps in the theory exist for which there is no evidence. A theory is defined as a well-tested explanation that unifies a broad range of observations. Intelligent design is an explanation of the origin of life that differs from Darwin's view. The reference book of Pandas and People is available for students to see if they would like to explore this view in an effort to gain an understanding of what intelligent design actually involves. As is true with any theory, students are encouraged to keep an open mind. The school leaves the discussion of the origins of life to individual students and their families. Notice not their teachers, but their families. It kind of gives you a hint about where they're coming from. As a standards-driven district, class instruction focuses on preparing students to achieve proficiency on standard-based assessments. So that was what the school district wanted read to every ninth grade student in biology. Well, 11 parents took exception to this, saying that it violated the separation of church and state, and they took it to federal court. So it arrived in federal district court. Now, the Supreme Court had outlawed the teaching of creationism in any public school, but this was a variation called intelligent design, and that had not been tested. So this was the first test of whether intelligent design violated the separation of church and state. And here's the court. Oh, sorry. Here's the courthouse. Here's one of the parents. She represents the 11. And here is the judge, who was a George W. Bush appointee and caused the plaintiff, the parents saying them, to be somewhat nervous, not knowing exactly how a conservative judge would view this challenge. Now, the Discovery Institute is this place, as its headquarters in Seattle, Washington, and they are the ones who promulgate creationism and intelligent design, and this is their definition. So the theory of intelligent design holds that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. That is a way of saying evolution. So natural selection, the idea is it proceeds by trial and error. Things make mutations. They're passed on to the next generation. And then natural selection picks among these to see who gets into the generation following that. And they conclude that this is not possible. Now, Professor Michael Behe was a witness in favor of intelligent design. He's a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University, and he's a fellow of this center, which is part of the Discovery Institute. And at the trial, Professor Behe introduced the poster child for intelligent design, which is something I worked on. It's the bacterial flagellum, a structure, he argues, that is the product of intelligent design, not of evolution. Now, the bacterial flagellum is the organelle of motility for many species of bacteria. So if you take a dish, this is Howard Berg's experiment, you put some E. coli on it, and you watch to see what happens, they swim around. And you can even make them mostly swim in one direction by putting some nice chemical. So each of these, sorry, I keep backing up here. Each of these white units is a single bacterium, and they seem to be pushed along. I think I'm going to have to back this up and start it again. Being pushed along by some invisible mechanism. So you can see them swimming around and darting here and there. Well, if you take an electron micrograph of an E. coli, this is what one of those white structures looks like. You know, this requires somebody who's younger than I am. There's too many possibilities. Anyway, this is what the cell body of the bacterium looks like. And these things, these fine structures out here, these are the propellers. They're corkscrew shaped. And the way this thing swims, it's got a little tiny rotary motor. By the way, this bar over here is the wavelength of light. So it gives you some idea of the scale. So what happens is this rotary motor spins this corkscrew, and it screws the cell, it pushes or screws the cell through the water, just sort of like a ship, as Bob was saying in my introduction. So in order to show that this was a rotary motor, Howard Berg stuck these cells down by one of their propellers. So they stuck them to the glass. And then you can observe the whole cell body will then rotate. Since these structures are too fine to be seen in the light microscope, you can certainly watch the whole cell body. It's sort of like taking the Queen Mary, starting up the engines, grabbing a hold of one propeller and watching the whole boat turn around instead of the propeller. So this is what it looks like. So these are each of these is a little bacterium, and you'll see when the movie starts that some of them, there's one spinning around, and you see the reverse direction. And anyway, that was a demonstration that there really is a little rotary motor propelling these things. Now, in order to actually see the flagella, which are invisible, Howard Berg made them fluorescent, so they glow in the dark, so to speak. And then you can see them. Now, these are taken at 500 frames a second. These rotary motors in here turn over when they're swimming at about 300 hertz or about 18,000 RPM. There are flagella in other species that turn over at 100,000 RPM. And so that's the basic mechanism of this organism. Now, during Behe's testimony in favor of intelligent design, that is, this was the structure designed, the lawyer defending intelligent design asked him if any other scientists thought that this structure appeared designed. And this is what he replied. In 1998, a man named David DeRosier, whom will be familiar to you by now, wrote an article in the journal Cell, which is a very prestigious scientific journal, it indeed is, entitled The Turn of the Screw, the Bacterial Flagellar Motor. Then it goes on to say, I'm a professor at Brandeis, and I've worked on it most of my career. In that article, he makes the statement, more so than other motors, the flagellum resembles a machine designed by a human. So David DeRosier also recognizes that the structure of the flagellum appears designed. I was incredibly embarrassed. I actually did write that. So, so this remark is what got me my 15 minutes of fame in NOVA program. And the question is, what motivated me to make that remark, and what do I think of intelligent design? Well, what I actually wrote initially, I said more so than other motors, the flagellum looks man-made. And the editor of the journal Cell said that was sexist. I couldn't say man-made. So I reworked the sentence to say, notice that human also has the word man in it. It's very hard to get around the word. And it's often amused me that things like gynecologist has the word guy in it, not spelled the same way, but you get the idea. So anyway, originally I wanted to say this, wound up saying that. Anyway, it was mildly embarrassing. Now, what does this structure actually look like? Here's a cartoon of the bacterial flagellum. So this is down at the bottom is inside the cell, and this is outside. So this is the propeller shown shortened because it's really, at this scale, the propeller would stick up several stories. And it has a propeller, it has a junction, it has a universal joint, just like your car does. It has a bushing, this orange thing is the bushing right here. It has a drive shaft, has a rotor and a stator and a little export apparatus stuck in here. So you see all of those names have analogs in mechanical things, which is what sort of prompted my remark. Well, what does one of these actually look like? Now here's an electron micrograph at a huge scale. The wavelength of light at this scale is about the size of, bigger than the size of this room actually. And you can see the parts here. This is the universal joint up here. The propeller is not in this. This is the bushing right here. There's the drive shaft. here's part of the rotor, and we don't isolate the stator, so we can't actually see this. Now, Bob Hazelcorn, when he introduced me, mentioned this thing about making three-dimensional images, and in fact, you can do that with this machine, and this is what a colorized three-dimensional image made from electron micrographs looks like. Each of these bumps that you see on here, for instance, is a single protein molecule. And this is actually 6 protein molecules. This is the stator. It's been put in. We didn't really see it. We just sort of imagined what it might look like. But each of these is a protein molecule. And you can see it's really quite an elegant looking machine. So this is a machine made from about 30 different kinds of proteins. Well, when the motors are turning, this is a movie made by Keiichi Namba and his collaborators, and this just shows you how the bundle of the filaments form a bundle at the back and push the cell. Now, here's a sort of movie showing you a little bit more about what the motor looks like when it's operating. That was the rotor, and sorry, this is the rotor down here. This is the drive shaft. There's the bushing. This is the stator. These are ions flowing in. There's the universal joint. Here's the propeller extending out. And that's roughly our best estimate about what this thing would actually look like if you could take a movie at these kinds of resolutions. Well, now this thing really does look like kind of, has all the analog parts of a regular motor, what you might have in your workshop, if you have a workshop, which I don't. But I said more so than other motors, this looks like something man-made, or designed by a human if you're offended. And here is a movie made by Ron Milligan, Ron Vale, and Graham Johnson. And this is kinesin. It walks along a tubular track, which is, you just see part of the tubular track. But you can see it's much more like Goofy sort of walking, Walt Disney's Goofy sort of walking. You talk about taking steps here, and you talk about having a foot that it puts down and so on. So it's much less like something man-made. But Ron Milligan, when I asked him if it was okay to show this, he said he was horrified to find out that the intelligent design people use his movie also to argue that this is too complicated to evolve. Well, in some sense, these motors really do look like something designed in the sense that they are parts that come together that have a function, that is to propel their cargo. So the question is there an intelligent designer? And so let's compare evolution and intelligent design. Now, the idea of an intelligent designer is not new. This Archdeacon William Paley, wrote a treatise in 1802. You can see the title, Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. And it's kind of ironic that Darwin actually read this and was quite taken with it. But of course, his theory completely alters our view of this idea of an intelligent designer. So Darwin's genius in evolution, which he referred to as descent with modification and natural selection, is how evolution can give rise to structures, organisms, and the like that look as if they're designed, so that nature seems to fit together with a niche for this kind of organism and so on and so forth. That was the genius, and that overturning of this idea that there was a deity that personally designed everything was what has caused a lot of the trouble not only then, but it continues today. And in fact, Darwin published this 150 years ago. He knew nothing about genes or about inheritance. The work of Gregor Mendel was published after Darwin, and in fact, people paid no attention to it until really about the 20th century. So what is key is that Darwin's theory is falsifiable, and that's what makes it science. But over the 150 years, over all of the discoveries that have been made that might have falsified it at any stage, it in fact was not falsified, it's in fact become strengthened. And so there's quite a massive data from the organismal level down to the molecular level that evolution, in fact, is the designer, if you want to call it that. So what then do the proponents of intelligent design say? What argument can they make? Well, Michael Behe made the following argument. He talked about an irreducibly complex structure like the flagellum, meaning if you take one part away, it doesn't work. Well, if you think about evolving a structure, when you evolve it, you don't have all the parts together. Therefore, it doesn't work. And if it doesn't do anything, natural selection will not select it or reject it, actually, is what will happen. So he argues that since natural selection can only work on things that do something, then this structure would have to evolve all in one fell swoop, because you need all 30 parts, many copies of them, in order for this thing to do anything, according to Behe. And therefore, it had to evolve in one fell swoop. So what is the probability that such a structure can arise in one fell swoop? Now, Professor William Dembski, who actually, I believe, went to school at this institution. I think he did. I think he has a degree from Chicago. Anyway, in math, I think. Anyway, so he did this calculation, and he calculated that there was one chance in 10 to the 1,170 tries. Now, if you took all the matter in the universe that we know about, and you made one copy of each protein, you wouldn't even come close to getting to that. If you repeated that operation, making different proteins with all the matter in the universe, 10 trillion times a second for the life of the universe, you still wouldn't come close to that number. It is genuinely a large number. And so he says this is impossible, and I agree with him. I think that is impossible. He is, by the way, a professor of philosophy and also a fellow of the Discovery Institutes and a proponent of intelligent design. So, I mean, the basic argument is a protein is a structure made of 20 different building blocks. And the probability of a typical protein flagellum is maybe 300 amino acids, these building blocks. There are 20 different types, and they're strung together. So if we ask a smallish protein of 200 amino acids and ask, what is the chance that if I can put together a series of 200 numbers, the numbers being from 1 to 20, and get an exact match? It's like a lottery ticket. Chance is 1 in 10 to the 260. And if you ask about 30 proteins in 30 different proteins and so on and so forth, you make adjustments for this and that, you get his number, I guess, or something like it. It doesn't matter. It's huge. We'll all agree on that. Whether it's the exact number or not, I don't really care. So they argue that since this is impossible, there must be an intelligent designer. So the question is there another mechanism by which you might generate a flagellum? After all, I'm a proponent of evolution, so what do people say? Well, the question is an incomplete structure useless? Because that's their argument. If it doesn't have any function, no natural selection. All right, so now one of the examples that the proponents of intelligent design love is a mousetrap. So if you take away a part of the mousetrap, it doesn't work. It has, I don't know, like 6 parts. If you take one away, it doesn't work, doesn't catch mice. Now, Ken Miller, who is a proponent of evolution, who was actually a witness at the trial, agrees that if you take a part away, it's not a good mousetrap, but he suggests that you can use the parts for something else. So here is Ken Miller, and here is his mousetrap, and he's going to take away the thing that holds the peanut butter. Usually people think cheese, but I'm told mice don't like cheese, they prefer peanut butter. So in case you're planning on doing some mouse catching tonight. You might keep that in mind. And here's the little thing that holds it. And he says, yeah, if you take those two parts away, it's no good at catching mice. But you know, it really has a good use. It can be used as a tie clasp. So he actually did this at the trial. And this is kind of recreation. So, so this structure is an example. I mean, you might start off with something that's a tie clasp, and then eventually you co-opt it the way evolution does to form something more, you know, a different function, a mousetrap. The evolution of the mousetrap is actually known. It came from a fish hook, a particular kind of fishing line, but that's a separate story. Molecular evolution could proceed with much greater probability if in fact it could proceed by co-opting existing structures and turning them to new uses. And the question is, if that were the case, what would you expect to see? Now, this man is a friend of ours. He's a sculptor in Italy, and he's made, when his father died, his father had a workshop, and there were a whole bunch of metal parts and he saved these, and in homage to his father, he made, this is a sculpture of a man who's reaching out with a hand. And if you look at this, you can see that this is something made from a bunch of existing parts. I mean, there's a sort of pulley wheel, there are washers and bolts and so on and so forth. So if you looked at some biological structure, you'd expect to see it made from parts that you find elsewhere, maybe doing similar things or doing something else. And the question is, do we see that? Well, here is a typical eukaryotic protein, alpha-actinin, and this is a schematic, it doesn't actually look like that, this is a schematic representation. And what it is a conglomeration of parts of different proteins that already exist. So these are called the calponin family of proteins, and their function is protein binding. The middle one, spectrin, this rust-colored one, they're flexibly segmented rods, and the one at the end, these is an EF family of hands, and these are having to do with regulation and protein binding. This is a structural protein that cross-links other proteins, and it's regulated. So it's made by sort of sticking together a whole bunch of different parts that exist elsewhere. You find the components elsewhere. It has very much that look. And these parts can be either physically linked together in a single protein, as this is the case, or simply stuck together like the flagellum. So the question is that true for the flagellum? And here are the parts that we saw in our cartoon. Over here, here's what they do. Here's the name of the protein. They're not very interesting names. But wherever it says yes, that means that that particular homologue of that particular protein exists elsewhere doing something else. Maybe something akin, but something else. So it indeed looks like a machine that has been sort of cobbled together from other parts. But you'd like something a little more direct than that. So let's take a look at our flagellar structure right here. Here it is. Here are the protein parts here. There are a bit more of them, but there's the universal joint. There's part of the propeller. Here's the rotor down here, and here's so on. Now, everybody knows what the bubonic plague is. It's a very nasty bacterium, and what happens when it attaches to your cell, it injects really nasty things into one of your cells and makes you sick. That's what it does. And the gadget that does that injection is, in fact, very much built from a subset of the proteins used in the flagellum. So the motor proteins are gone. This thing doesn't rotate. But you can see by this color combination the homologous parts from this, the bacterial flagellum, and this. So this, its sole thing is to to act as a kind of hypodermic needle to inject things into other cells, but it's lacking all the things that have to do with rotation. So here's a partial structure. I don't know whether this came first or this came first. It doesn't matter. The point is that you can find partial structures, and this is only one example for the flagellum alone of a partial structure that actually does something. So it is not irreducibly complex in the sense that if you take away a part, it doesn't work anymore. So let's contrast evolution and intelligent design. So the main argument that the proponents of intelligent design made was that the probability of having everything come in one fell swoop was unlikely. I think I agree with that. But the other point why this comes under the category of religion, if you say there's intelligent designer, what other predictions can you possibly make? Whatever you find, you can say, well, you know, that was sort of the plan. So I think there's an onus on them, which they insist is science, to say, well, what predictions do you have to make? Whereas evolution makes many predictions, and I've shown you some evidence that those things that you expect to see, you do find. Of course, they say, well, nobody saw this evolve. Well, that's true, but what you're always looking at, it's sort of like hunting for fossils in a way. You can see the evidences of things that you know are predicted. So, I mean, that is basically how I got involved in this, what I argued on the NOVA program. But what's really interesting is to see what the judge said after these many days of trial that include other issues like religion and so on and so forth. It's really quite a lengthy trial. I've only covered a little bit. So he said the proper application of both the endorsement and Lemon tests, those are things having to do with the separation of church and state, to the facts of this case make it abundantly clear that the board's intelligent design policy violates the Establishment Clause, but not about separation of church and state. In making this determination, we have addressed the seminal question of whether ID is science. We have concluded that it is not, and moreover, that intelligent design cannot uncouple itself from its creationist and thus religious antecedents. Both defendants and many of the leading proponents of intelligent design make a bedrock assumption that is utterly false. Their presupposition is that evolutionary theory is antithetical to a belief in the existence of a supreme being and to religion in general. Repeatedly in this trial, plaintiff scientific experts testified that the theory of evolution represents good science, is overwhelmingly accepted by the scientific community, and that it in no way conflicts with nor does it deny the existence of a divine creator. To be sure, Darwin's theory of evolution is imperfect. However, the fact that a scientific theory cannot yet render an explanation on every point should not be used as a pretext to thrust an untestable alternative hypothesis grounded in religion into the science classroom or to misrepresent well-established scientific propositions. This was only a part of his conclusion. In fact, his whole judgment is actually quite lengthy, and it took him quite a while to write it, and he said he wrote it because he knows that this will not be the last time the courts face this. Because even though the Supreme Court ruled out the teaching of creationism, this particular federal case only applies to the Dover School District. So outside of that, school districts are not bound by this ruling in the same way if a Supreme Court ruled. And so there's apparently very recently an issue coming up in Louisiana. So I would please ask you to ensure that your public schools continue to teach science, not religion, as science. I want to thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. The question is, could the issue go to the Supreme Court? Well, what happened was there was an election during the trial or just before the trial, and on the school district, all the people on the board who were in favor of this were turfed out. So by the time the decision came down, the school board was in fact in favor of evolution, and so there was no challenge to this ruling. Otherwise, it might well have gone there. But you can't take it without a case, so you need a case. This case is over, so there's no challenge. In Louisiana, possibly. That was just, there's a really nice website run by, having a senior moment here. Well, I'll think of it. Anyway, ask me later when I think of it. Are there other about it? So the question is, what motivated me to spend the better part of my career studying the bacterial flagellum? Well, when I first heard about it, I was a postdoctoral fellow, and I heard that that people had this idea that this thing rotated. There was a rotary machine. I thought that was absurd. So when I came back, I was in Cambridge, England. When I came back to this country, I went to see Howard Berg, and I said, I want to see the movies that prove this. I want to see the evidence, because it seems so unlikely. So that sort of sparked my interest, and then I went to give a talk at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and I ran into this dynamo, Lucy Shapiro. And I was lucky to get off just agreeing to look at the propeller by electron microscopy, much less doing everything else she had in mind. And that's what really started me out, was looking at that. And then slowly you get interested in, how does the motor work? Because at the time, it was the only rotary motor known. I think now there are 3 or 4 other rotary motors, some of which are not known. Yes?
What is the source of energy?
Oh yeah, I didn't really talk about that. The one in E. coli is powered by protons. It sounds very space age, really hydrogen ions. So cells store energy by pumping hydrogen ions, bacteria do, out of the cell. So there's a voltage gradient and a pH or a proton gradient across the cell. And this motor directly converts that chemical and electrochemical gradient into energy. So when the proton flows through, the motor, the stator pulls on the rotor. Has this inspired any work for applications in the motor industry? No, but the Department of Defense once told me they are very interested in these little motors that generate, I don't know, it's something like a trillionth of a horsepower. So I'm not sure, but nano things are very popular now, so maybe there might be uses for that. Yes. Yes, so the question is whether the intelligent design movement was an end run on creationism. Behe and Dembski both say not, that they believe it's science. They're also religious, but I think for the Discovery Institute it's very much an end run on teaching of introducing creationism. The program by NOVA is wonderful. Aside, not counting that I'm in it, that's not why, but it's really a very good program. You can watch it online. So if you type my name in NOVA, or just NOVA and Intelligent Design, or NOVA and Dover or something, you'll get it, and you can watch it on your computer. Yes?
Are there any motors for which there's a pretty good evolutionary picture yet? Do we have any?
Sure. I think some of the ATPase motors, there are enzymes. Somebody else might remember better than me. They're the AAA ATP binding proteins. Ed would know. Yeah, related to dynein. Okay, so there's an example. Yeah, and myosin. It's the RAC and Rho have the same these GTP signaling proteins. Yeah. So there are examples of where these come from. Yes, and then you.
Did you have much encounter with Judge Jones? He sounds like a real.
I didn't. I didn't. I wasn't a witness at the trial or anything. I was just quoted. Yeah. So the question is, from what did the flagellum evolve? And I don't think there's an answer to that. We have an answer to the question about what was a more primitive structure and what did it do. I don't think we know the answer to that. I mean, this needle complex, because it infects eukaryotic cells, some people have argued that eukaryotic cells came afterwards, so this was derived from the flagellar motor. But there are also arguments that in the other direction as well, so I don't know the answer to that. Yes, so the question is, this gentleman disagrees with the judge's conclusion that there's no conflict between religion and science. And he asked what my view is. And I always lie low on that because I think I agree with you that there are certain things that are very hard to explain. But Ken Miller, who is very much an evolutionist, debates the creationists, he's very good at it, is a practicing Roman Catholic. And he does not believe in the sort of God that micromanages the world and people. His view is when he prays that he will do the right thing. Sort of like what Abraham Lincoln says, I don't pray that God will be on our side, pray that we'll be on God's side. So he's very much that sort of form. But I do see some conflicts, at least certainly with many people's views of religion. But, I mean, you can always define religion, and Stephen Jay Gould has written a book about this, and so has Ursula Goodenough. Both of them talking about this kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, interface between science and religion. Ed, there's a motor in our key as well as U-Bacter.
I'm asking this evolved independently.
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I don't want to say anything. I just don't know the answer. Well, these motors are found sort of peppered through the eubacteria. And bacteria are notorious for giving each other DNA, even though they're unrelated. That's why when you take antibiotics, you can develop resistant strains of your normal intestinal fauna. And then when you get sick, they're happy to give the pathogenic organism all of this resistance. So they do that, and I sort of suspect that there's been a lot of that. Yes. So the question is, given the judge's statement, many scientists believe that there isn't a conflict between religion, why does the religious right push back so hard? Is that sort of the question? Yeah. Oh, so what are we doing that we should do better to convince them that there's not a conflict? I think my view, and one of the things I think is wrong with all the Darwin celebrations is they're always addressed to the wrong audience. They're always people who more or less accept evolution. And I think on the right, the religious right, I don't think there's any way of getting to them. I think they will never, ever buy evolution. It's on religious grounds because they're literalists. So they don't believe that the Earth is more than 5,000 years old, whereas we have clocks. You can actually measure the age of rocks. There's timepieces built into them. So I think that will never happen. But it's the big, broad middle part of 50% of the people in the US, which is maybe arguably the most advanced scientific country, that 50% of the people either aren't sure or believe in intelligent design. What are we doing wrong? We're somehow, I think, in these celebrations that we have for Darwin, they really never get to those people. They never watch them. And I've often thought that the best way of getting to them was this movie, Inherit the Wind, which was a sort of dramatization of the Scopes trial. And that was a very popular movie. And I think we really need something like that again so that we'll give people something that they'll watch. And I always thought this was the Darwin's birthday and the birthday of the theory of evolution, this would be a good venue to, to celebrate it. So the message would get across, because a message is really quite powerful scientifically. Oh, let me take some away at the back. Yeah, I had part of this on the slide, and when I gave a practice talk, they told me I should probably ditch it. But and there's some argument about this. So the question is, how many different proteins, if you don't count homologs, how many different proteins are there in the biosphere? And there have been estimates made, and I think not everyone buys them, but the estimate is there are about 15,000. So the probability, instead of picking, having to put together a sequence of 200 numbers, 1 to 20, you really have to pick 1 in 15,000. You could make that sort of argument, but I don't think everyone agrees on that. So I think the answer is we don't really have a probability. Just the evidence that once nature has a good protein fold and a function, it just uses it wherever it can. I mean, you see these in not just these proteins I've shown, but in almost all of them. If you look at them, they really show evidence. They're related. There was another question back there, and then, sorry, I'm not sure. Could I put forward a hypothesis that? For the theory of evolution. Yeah, so something that's falsifiable. Sure. As an example, suppose it turned out to be the case that every species of organism had a different DNA code. The kind of evolution we're talking about would not be possible. Suppose that there were no transitional forms found in the fossil record. Suppose that the clocks that we found in rocks that measure the age of the Earth really showed it was only 5,000 years old. So there are lots of junctures. In fact, Lord Kelvin argued that the Earth couldn't be, at the time they were talking about just millions, tens of millions of years. He said it couldn't be that old, it would have cooled off. And so he was very much opposed to it. And he'd made some calculations about, that he worked on black body radiation, so he knew about radiation. It would have cooled off. And it turns out he was wrong about it for two reasons. One is he didn't have the calculation of the amount of heat from the sun falling on the Earth. He was wrong about that. He was off. His measurements were off. And the second thing is he didn't know about radioactivity. So about half of that missing energy comes from radioactive decay inside the Earth. So those are all examples of instances where, the theory of evolution would have been sunk. And those are very different kinds of measurements, some from physics, some from biology. There was yes. So the question was, were the people on the Board of Education voted out because of their stance? The answer is that's what people say. It's an election, so. But that was the idea. So the election, when you look at this program, was very much, pro versus anti-evolution. That's how people were featured. The people running with their Ford, they were on the board and they were against it. So I think that seems pretty clear. Yes. So the question is evolution being taught, especially in the lower grades? Certainly is in college, but the question is, in 9th grade biology, are we teaching evolution? If you use books, Ken Miller has written both a high school and a college text, and evolution is very much present in his. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe somebody else does. My children are in their 40s, so it's been a while since I've had to deal with what they teach. It's science. You have to teach it straight up. I don't think you can hold back. You have to. So the question was, is there some way of teaching evolution that won't offend people in the ride? And I think you want to teach science as science. I think, and you want to not try and tiptoe around, people's religious objections or thoughts or ideas or conceptions. And you want to teach science the best way you know it. And there are observations and there are theories, and the question is, how well do the observations, what are the theories, how well do these observations fit them? What is still unknown? What are we pretty sure of, and what are we still have questions about? So, and I don't think there's any way around it. I don't think you'll ever convince them. Yes, way at the back. I'm not even sure how. There was a very interesting remark. I'm not sure I can paraphrase in the form of a question, but it dealt with Dawkins's book, The God Delusion. Yeah, and a critique of it made by, and I didn't, Tom Nagel, yeah. I'm not sure I read that, so I don't, what I wanted to do here was to mostly focus on the science rather than on the question about whether there is or isn't a God, and whether people like Dawkins are right or people like Ken Miller are right, because it's just so far out of, I mean, I know what I believe, but I think that's really not the issue. But I think if you look at scientists, we should probably wrap this up pretty soon, but the religious beliefs of scientists, there are scientists on both sides. Some scientists are agnostics or atheists, depending on what you want to call them, and there are a number that aren't. So I think that kind of friction will always exist. I think it's